Coming up, why the Brooklyn Nets' next 3 games will determine their season's future.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, and I'm breaking down the New York Giants all off season long on the One Giant podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And Doug, you were doing the Lord's work over the weekend, crunching the numbers, following up on another loss, this time at the hands of the Denver Nuggets. And we realized that with the Cavs back-to-back here and then Saturday night special against Miami, it all hangs in the balance for the Brooklyn Nets.
Yeah, like depending on how you want this season to go and finish up for the Nets, these next 3 games will basically kind of tell probably the rest of the story. I hate to say that with this many games left because – obviously they've only played 71 games, so they still have 11 games remaining. So these final 3, they still have 8 more after these next 3. But who these next 3 games are against, where everyone is in the standings, and just sort of like what the trajectory is around who the Nets play after this really pretty much could solve it, like about where it's headed. And, obviously things can happen and games need to be played. You need to play out all 82, especially when you're sitting at this part of the standings. But these games have a massive amount of leverage, and we'll go through why. And I think we'll kind of have an understanding of like where the Nets are going to stand going into play-in or playoff future based on basically what happens here, barring something crazy unforeseen over the next couple weeks.
Yeah, and listen, as it currently stands right now, the Brooklyn Nets are in the 6th position. They are 1 game ahead of the Miami Heat. They have 9 games remaining. That's Miami, and we'll talk about them coming up here. But as you say, these 3 games, 2 against Cleveland and then Miami, we've seen the Nets. They've shown being capable of beating good teams. They beat the Nuggets recently, and then more recently, they lost to the Nuggets. And when you look in behind it, after 2 games against Cleveland, after Miami, there are some nice landing spots. But I think that there's a world where even before Saturday night, potentially, the Nets will already kind of know where their fate lies. And it's funny, too, because you have some of the numbers around playoff percentages, et cetera, that should buoy the Nets fans' perspective here. But as we move along, I think we're going to talk about how, I don't want to say sinking ship, but it could feel like all of the excitement in this post-trade era for Brooklyn is going to really go out of that balloon.
Okay, so they play, right, and so the next 2 games are back-to-back games against the Cleveland Cavaliers, who are really incentivized right now to stick in the 4 seed. They are 2.5 games up on the Knicks. They're 5 games up in the Nets, 4 in the loss column as it stands right now here on March 20th. I don't think the part where the Nets can claw back into the 4th seed, like we had spoken about for previous podcasts, is really all that likely, although we might be singing a different tune if the Nets are somehow able to sweep the Cavs. That would at least put it within shouting distance. I still think it'd be tough. Right. Like I think that would be ultimately like a pretty heavy lift to be able to do. Following those 2 games up with the game against Miami, which is probably going to end up being the most critical game that there is, depending on how the rest of this shakes out. Right now, they are 2 up in the loss column, 1 up in just the regular games back piece from Miami, who sits in the 7th seed. And obviously, if you're, just figuring this out, the 7th seed is important because that's part of the playing game. When you're in the 6th seed, you're guaranteed a playoff spot. When you're in the 7th seed, you have to win your way into the last playoff spot. It's a little bit easier because you have to, basically you have 2 chances to win 1 game and they're going to be at home for you. But you don't want to be in this position, right? The Nets were in this position last year. It's just a nail-biting scenario. And that game, if they're able to take out Miami in that game, they would probably still have just enough of a buffer to start feeling okay about it. And that's why these games have huge leverage. They could move up in the standings here if they're able to somehow take care of business against Cleveland. if they're able to beat this Miami team, it's for some reason just can never miss a shot within the last 3 minutes of a game for basically the entire
Right.
season. They lose the entire game and they come back and win by like 2 points. It happens every single game with this team. But that's where it's going to be. Like they're really, when those 3 games are done, especially against Miami, we're going to be sitting here kind of, I think, understanding, because basically everyone's landing after that. And I'll go through this in a second, but no one has it all that hard afterwards. Maybe Miami has it a little harder than the rest, but it's not that hard for anyone. And these teams are going to play teams kind of the rest of the way that kind of want to lose. And it's just funny how it's just sometimes really funny about how the end of the season NBA shakes itself out, because everyone's motivations are just all over the place.
Well, ironically enough, it's if it had never unfolded the way it did at the trade deadline, we could be circling these same 3 games for a very different reason for the Brooklyn Nets and saying, hey, this could be keeping Cleveland behind you in the standings. The Nets are trying to lock into the 3 seed. Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, right? All of the ideas of being a high-level, deep playoff run team. Instead, just as critical, but for very different reasons. And just to remind everybody, too, the Knicks, who are ahead, obviously, of Brooklyn in the standings, there's 2.5 games back right now between the 6 and the 5 seed. Cleveland has a 2.5 game lead over top of the Knicks as well. So just to reiterate your point around why it matters to Cleveland, this could be the difference for them as they look down the stretch of their season. 7-3 over their last 10 as well. Knicks 7-3. Like, if we get these next 2 wins and the Knicks stumble 1 game, and we'll talk about schedules for Miami here as well and why it all gets pretty jumbled, all of a sudden that could be a 4 seed that gets to prepare for their playoff run as opposed to having to fight for it as they move forward. We'll break all those little nuances that are happening around Brooklyn Nets and their life coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, we are going to tell you about FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. The tournament is heating up right now. If you're, kind of just locked into that over the weekend, you know what I'm talking about. Obviously, NBA storming toward the aforementioned playoffs. Right now, over on FanDuel, you can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. It's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. You can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to threes drained. I'm in a terrible sweat here for MVP right now. Had Jokic at really long odds over to start the season. That looked absolutely like full money. It was like, hey, maybe we'll just get a little Embiid hedge in here. Never did it. That tide has turned, my friends. Dougie is out of the hedge territory and now out of the hedge territory and into just the being mad territory. So that's where we are over at FanDuel, but it's fun. This is why these are the kind of things you want to be able to sweat down the entire season. FanDuel makes it very, very easy. Not just the awards kind of stuff. They get the spread, the money line, the total, player points, rebounds, assists. It's all there. You can pile things together in the same game parlay as well. Don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. It's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Okay, so when we turn our attention, we're going to talk about Miami's schedule here too, because that's the most critical right behind them, as we said. But when we look at the Brooklyn Nets schedule, go with me for a moment, Doug, beyond these next 3 games, where they'll play Orlando twice over the final stretch. They'll also play Houston. They'll also play Detroit. So those 4 games just by themselves are ones you'd say, let's earmark them for victory. Knowing that the Nets have 11 games and then 8 after this big 3 stint coming up here, where do you see that record being over those other 8 games? Because I think that's as important as anything to kind of say, well, regardless of what happens against Cleveland twice and then Miami, can you still make it up on the back end of this season? Do you think it's possible for them to go 5-3 over those final 8 games?
Oh, I mean, it should. After they finish Cleveland, Miami, I mean, Orlando should be a win. Houston should be. Houston's playing kind of tough against some of these teams, but it really should be a win. Atlanta, they're going to be fighting for it. So let's put that one as a coin flip. Utah, I at that point, they probably have raised the white flag if they haven't already. So I think that should be a W. Minnesota, they're kind of in this. They're probably fighting. So that one's going to be close. Detroit should be a W. Orlando W. And then Philly. It's hard to say where Philly is because they could still be in #1 seed territory. It's a little hard to tell right now. They're close enough. They're 2.5 back right now. That one I think will probably
fighting right now, even with Boston in the 3 seed.
Yeah. Right. So there's basically a 3-way logjam at the top of the East with those 3 teams, and the seeding will really matter. You would love to have the #1 seed because you don't want to like just being able to get out of any of these kind of like bottom of the barrel, because none of the play-in teams are that scary, Nets included, right?
Yeah.
So like you'd love to be first of all walking into one of those scenarios, and then to not have to face one of the other two teams, because if you're Boston, if you're one of those three teams, you would love the other two teams, the second and third teams, to duke it out in the next round, and you could avoid them for one more round, right? So like
The Clevelands, the New York Knicks of the world. Yeah.
exactly. You'd much rather be in that territory than one of those three teams we just mentioned. So it's gonna be interesting to see what happens with those teams getting near the end, especially with Philly, because I think it probably won't be decided, and Philly will probably be trying at that point. Would be my guess. One more thing about these next three games too, and the Knicks also. What's interesting with the Nets, and it's just another crazy part of the season, is that the Nets actually own the tiebreakers. Right now, they own the tiebreaker with the Knicks because they won the season series. If they can win one of these Cleveland games, they'll own the season series against Cleveland, so they'd own that tiebreaker too. And so just being able to have that as part as like and with Miami, they would own this. Sorry, yeah, with Miami, they'd own the tiebreaker also. Like they banked so many wins early in the year when they were actually good and had superstars that like they can tie these teams and still own the tiebreaker. So they're in like a really advantageous situation against all three of the teams. It's just a matter if they can just get enough wins, right? Because they can have the same record.
Yeah. Well, then, but the Knicks series, actually, they're tied 2 games apiece in that series.
Oh, did they? Did I miscount that? Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay,
No. But then they're good. They're good against Cleveland. You said one game against Cleveland got the job done. It was actually these last times that they played the Knicks.
Yeah, my bad. Okay. Yeah.
That ended up brutalizing them. But to your point, it still works. It still works, especially when you talk about Miami being in behind them, right? The other thing to me is, 6 out of the last 7 games for the Nets are at home, by the way. And for whatever that's been worth, I think this team in the post-trade era has been far too inconsistent regardless of where they're playing. Like every game that you think they should be winning, if it's on the road or at home, it doesn't matter. They've shown they can beat good teams, playoff teams. They've also shown that they can lose to anybody on the spectrum. I do. Go ahead.
No, I'm just laughing. It's just funny to say. You cracked me up when you said they've shown the ability to lose to everybody.
Yeah, their greatest strength is that you don't know whether or not they will or will not.
Appreciate it.
But the other thing is too. So the other one then is the Miami piece of this, what I think is obviously is critical, because let's say in the worst case scenario that they lose both games against Cleveland, okay, and that's at an earshot. And they don't, the tiebreaker doesn't matter anymore, whatever. But then you go about saying that Miami only plays Wednesday night, and then they play Brooklyn on Saturday. So there's going to be 2 games that unfold here to 1 game against for Miami. Well, they're going to be playing the New York Knicks. And this is where it gets kind of funky, because when you look inside the standings, all of a sudden, if the Brooklyn Nets somehow swept the Cleveland Cavaliers over these next 2 games and Miami were to beat the Knicks, well, now the Nets are maybe just sniffing around that conversation of getting out of the 6th and back into the 5th. But in doing so, those final remaining 8 games become that much more critical, because now you're still fighting off a surging Miami at the back end of the season. I think they're in a good spot, but Miami having a schedule that lines up with, after New York, they'll have obviously the Nets, and then Toronto, the Knicks again. Both those games are going to be on the road. They have Dallas mixed in there, who has a lot to figure out and try to work, and have maybe Kleber be their closer now. We don't know for sure. And then they go with Detroit, Philly, Washington. Those are all road games, and closing out with Orlando. By the way, when I was looking up like playoff odds, the Orlando Magic do have less than a 0.1% chance to make the playoffs right now in the East. So you got to watch out for those guys. They could make a run here. But Miami has a real path here to get wins. I think it lines up just shakily enough where there's a 3-game stretch here, 4-game stretch if you include against the Nets, that they can end up going 500. And that can allow the Nets to kind of safeguard themselves, but it will still leave them in a position of saying, you have to go win your schedule. And again, to my famous quote, they've shown the ability to lose to anybody. There's no guarantee that Brooklyn goes those final 8 games and picks up 6 wins, which in theory they should be able to. But I could also tell you a story where they go 3-5.
Yeah, it's not. You can't get the team the benefit of the doubt at this point for sure. Right. We're not in that territory. If you just look at the numbers in terms of remaining strength of schedule, Brooklyn has the 5th easiest from here on in. Cleveland has the easiest according to Tankathon, kind of by a lot. Like Cleveland has just the easiest schedule in the whole entire NBA to close out the season. So this is the other part where it is going to be tough with that group. New York has the 27th, so the fourth easiest. All these, and then Miami has the 19th, right? So like Miami does have a little tougher road to hoe when it comes to just how the overall records break down. Again, this can be a little skewed because you can be top heavy. Like one game against the Sixers is going to make your remaining strength of schedule look a lot harder, but it's only one game. It's only one.
I'll tell you right now, I just looked at Cleveland's schedule, though, not to interrupt you, and they certainly do have one of the easiest schedules down the stretch here.
They do. It's just by remaining strength of schedule with their win percentage. It's like 44% win percentage. The next closest is 46. I mean, it's a huge gap between how easy their schedule is. And like I said, the one game against Miami, the one game where Miami plays Philadelphia, that means a lot to their schedule. Like once they clear that game away, it drops off a lot. I mean, I know Brooklyn has it too. So this is all to be said. Like I will say, what is fun is having these games matter down the stretch. Is you always want to be here. Like you always rather be in this spot than, well, one, obviously, not tanking. I know let me just get this out of the way. I know people have said, oh, the Nets should go into the tank. This is, and just lose games. I think when I hear the fan base say stuff like that, I really cringe because two reasons. One, they've really never experienced a tanking season. They've had seasons that haven't been gone that great, right? Like, right. And they've definitely, there's been, the expectations have not just gotten anywhere close to where we thought they were going to be to start the season, yada, yada, yada. Nets fans have had plenty of heartache in here. So it's not that. But they've never experienced what a true tanking season. It's brutal, dude. Like watching some of these teams and how they're operating, and Nets fans have never had to do it. Now, one, because the Nets have never had these draft picks, so it's never mattered. Like they traded away so many draft picks worth of seasons where even when they weren't that good, they had to keep trying because there was no incentive at all to lose, right? So they weren't, and that's why you saw the fun teams with D'Lo and the Harris group and Jared Dudley, yucking it up with Ben Simmons in the playoffs. It's because they just kind of had to keep trying. There was no incentive to lose. You really, I know people want to do it because it seems like, oh, it's great to go for draft picks. And it is if you're in that situation, but you really need to be built pretty differently from a fan base. Like it's hard, man. Watching these teams, if you watch, I was watching the Pacers and the Hornets earlier tonight. It's brutal. Like it's brutal. The Pistons, I've watched a lot of Pistons lately.
Shout out Tony East, man. Does the Lord's work on Locked On Pacers.
My point is, I know people want to say that, and in a macro sense, tanking makes sense. Like from, how you can better your team by being able to spike some of these all-time great guys at the top of the draft. I get it. Yeah. I'm just saying that the Nets fans have also been afforded a situation where they've never had to watch like a full season of tankathon stuff, and for like ever. Right? Like when was the last time they've tried every single season because of the nature of how the team was put together? I just really want people to keep that in mind when they say, hey, let's tank it. You got to really love your team at that point because they're just going out there with not putting their best foot forward. And I don't know. Anyway, so soliloquy over on that part of it. But like, I do get a little, cringy when we probably mentioned it before too, when it's like, hey, we should tank it. I'm like, I don't think as a fan, what you're signing up for or something like that.
And the most important thing is coming up here in a second, I'm going to pose the philosophical question about what could be learned over the remainder of this season that could potentially impact the Nets beyond this year and going into the offseason. But to your point though, when you think you want a team to tank to accomplish goal X, whatever that may be, go look at the teams that have done that and see how long it takes after that first tank that you end up tanking again and maybe again, right? The road down to what you think is going to ultimately lead to an upward success does not always cross the finish line, even when you try your best to get there. Even teams that have done it successfully still don't end up cresting whatever that ultimate goal is going to be. Deep playoff runs, etc. It took the Philadelphia 76ers a long time to round themselves into form after trusting the process, and that ultimately came by making some pretty dramatic changes to their team. But we'll focus in on the Brooklyn Nets. I will pose a question to Doug around what will be learned over the remainder of this year, and where does this Nets team finish? Let's dive into that here in a second. Okay, so the first thing that I want to clear off the deck here too is that as the time of this recording, which is Monday night, it's worth noting that the New York Knicks are playing basketball right now against the Minnesota Timberwolves, and they are losing. They are losing in the third quarter by a handful of points right now. So there is some world where we look back across this, and the Knicks, before the Nets take the court on Tuesday night, they could actually gain a half game on them and be 3 games back. Other little funny note I just wanted to bring up is that, you know how divisions don't mean a darn thing in the NBA anymore? Except for when you have a season series that's tied, and then you need to figure out what would the tiebreaker be. Go to conference records, go to division records. The Brooklyn Nets, as it stands right now, looking at them and the Knicks, 8-8 in the division for New York, 7-8 in the division for the Brooklyn Nets. So these games are going to matter. The divisions are going to matter in a weird way they never have potentially for Brooklyn. Do you think, I'll go with the high level first. Do you think anything's going to be learned over the back end of this season? Say the team falls apart and they end up in the play-in. Is that going to influence what decisions this organization makes in the offseason? Or do you think that they are already locked in on the Mikal Bridges, the Nicholas Claxton, right, and how they feel about that as the core, and then all these other pieces will sort themselves out around it? Because I do wonder about the sample size they're getting right now and if that influences how they approach things beyond this year.
Yeah, I don't know if it, like, from like an overall sense, if it's going to change too much of what they think their plan is right now. I mean, it's a little unclear what the plan is, like, except for it's like, thank goodness Bridges is good. Like, that seems to
you can't change our plan. We don't have a plan.
I mean, that kind of seems like what it is now. It's like, thank goodness Bridges is like way better than most people thought. It's the only thing that softened this whole thing, probably. Like, is that they've won a couple games that maybe you didn't expect them to, and Bridges feels like you got a real guy here back, right? And from the Durant trade. I mean, beyond that, I don't know if there is tons to learn. I do think we have a good sense of who the team is, like, from like a young player standpoint, or like, a middle young standpoint with Bridges and Claxton going into next season. It doesn't look like Simmons is coming back, so I don't think we're learning anything there at all. Once, wash, rinse, repeat with that for the second season in a row. And so I don't really know if, like, losing in the play-in for the Nets would be all that different than losing in the first round necessarily. I think, like, if they somehow got through the playoffs and won a first round series, which I think is incredibly unlikely, I think that might change sort of like their excitement levels about what the team can become going forward. But short of that, like, I don't see a loss in the play-in or a loss in the first round as two. I see them as very similar outcomes. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I overall agree with you. I think the difference would be, for me, it's like, if you make the playoffs officially, not the play-in, that then, and okay, let's paint this picture. Ending up in the play-in and losing and getting knocked out. Okay, that's all relative to saving yourself and being in, avoiding the play-in games and losing in 4, right? But the difference I could paint would be falling into the play-in, then winning that play-in game, earning your way into that playoff spot, and then getting 4 games. Because then by the end, even if you get swept, you get 5 playoff games, 5 playoff level experiences for this group of players. Most of them, whether it's with, previous seasons, we know Spencer has it, DFS has it, Mikal, Cam Johnson, right? And even the guys on the Nets, like Cam Thomas has been around, Nicholas Claxton has had playoff experience, but it'll be different now. Like, Nicholas Claxton is viewed as the second best player on this team going forward with Mikal Bridges. So there's that part of it that I think would be valuable. But, and I agree with your sentiment around, it's like, ultimate influence on what they choose to do, maybe not. But from the fan base perspective, I'll tie it back to what you said, wanting them to tank. Don't want them to tank. Want them to claw and fight their way. Yes. And then if they get there, maybe you steal a game, or maybe you barely lose to the 76ers in one of those 4 games you get swept in on a buzzer beater, right? Like, have those moments, because I think that potentially could change how things feel going into an offseason, as opposed to slowly burning out after trading away Kevin Durant, right?
Yeah, okay. There, I totally agree with you. Like, I know what I want to happen here. I want them to get into the playoffs and be in a first-round playoff series. I know that definitively. I do not want to see them playing game. I would much rather watch them. I'd much rather watch them just get swept in a first-round playoff series and fight hard. With the idea that they can, like, steal some games here or there and make it tough on other teams. I'd much rather have that than go out in the first round with the play-in. I think, and I will say where this team differs from last year's team. So last year's team got swept in the first round after getting through the play-in, right? That's exactly what happened now. But yeah, the feelings around it would be significantly different this time around that outcome than it was last year. Last year was a massive disappointment because the expectations were so high. It was Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving. It's like, hey, this team has to show you something. They showed you almost nothing and got really kind of embarrassed by the Celtics, which was in some ways a very fitting end to the train wreck that was last season.
It just wasn't.
Yeah,
it wasn't particularly good.
It couldn't have ended any other way. So like whatever.
Yes.
But it was just that was what the train was barreling down the track toward that outcome kind of from the beginning. This time around, the feeling is different. So I would be okay with that outcome because I think it'd be a really fun rooting experience. Like that would be, Nets Sixers in the first round. That'd be awesome, right? Even if the outcome was that the Sixers kind of, trounced them or whatever. Really, Nets Celtics in the first round make it tough. Any of those situations, I'd much rather see that than anything else, because ultimately when it comes down to fandom, like that is what you want to do. Like you want to see them put their best foot forward. I think they have a version of this team that can give other teams problems if they can just get it to click. And so I think that, so just from an outcome standpoint, I'm like rooting harder for this team than I have at a lot of other points during the Superstar era, for sure. I almost get more frustrated with them than different versions of the Nets before, just because I want them to be good. But I think that's just where we are as we close out the season.
Yeah, because by the way, we're always waiting for the other version of the Nets. Like, oh yeah, once we get to like the conference finals, then we'll start thinking about what they should be accomplishing, and we never got there. So you kind of waited to gear yourself up. In that being the case, I'll close out by saying these next two games against Cleveland, they obviously feel critical, but I'll be honest with you, you could lose these two games, play them tough, look like you're figuring things out. You beat Miami, and maybe Miami comes off of losing a game to the Knicks. That would probably, still be a very winnable scenario down the stretch with those 8 games and that schedule that we talked about. Man, I hope they avoid the play-in game for sure, because that will feel like an accomplishment for this group of players. We'll see how it plays out, but these next 3 games, man, it is going to be, you'll hear it. You'll find us on the post games on YouTube and the way that we're sweating every single play.
All right, we will be back following the Cleveland game on Tuesday night, so make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets on that aforementioned YouTube. You can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts as well, but we're going to be hitting up the YouTube Live, and we always go extra on YouTube, answering questions. And it's got a lot of fan favorites in there too, or podcast favorites in there that bring up some great stuff that's closing the show. So if you're listening on the podcast, make sure you're over on Locked On Nets YouTube.
Piper, there's a big difference between winging it and seeing what happens. Now let's see what happens. That, my friends, is MacGruber.
MacGruber, one of the all-time great poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
MacGruber!